Hello, I'm Barbara Fraser, editor of EarthBeat, National Catholic Reporter's digital publication covering the climate crisis from a perspective of faith and environmental justice. It's a pleasure to be with you today to talk about the ways in which Catholics around the country are living out Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. I hope some of these ideas spark discussion in your parish or diocese, and that you can think of new ways to bring Laudato Si to life in your faith community. It's very appropriate to have this conversation today because it coincides with the United Nations Climate Conference that's taking place in Glasgow, Scotland. The conference has been held every year since 1995, but this is an especially important year, as we'll see in a few minutes. Pope Francis has been a leading voice in the call for stronger action on climate change from the world's leaders, especially those of the wealthiest and most industrialized nations. And many Catholics are among the people of faith bringing an ethical voice to the debates in Glasgow. So today, let's look at why the climate conference matters to Catholics, why Pope Francis has spoken out so strongly about climate action, and what Catholics in California are doing and can do to live out Laudato Si. You probably recognize this prayer, the Canticle of the Sun, or Laudato Si, Praise be, by St. Francis. All praise be yours, my Lord, through all that you have made. And first, my Lord brother Sun, who brings the day and light you give to us through him. How beautiful is he, how radiant in all his splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears the likeness. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister moon and stars. In the heavens you have made them, bright and precious and fair. All praise be yours, my Lord, through brothers wind and air, and fair and stormy, all the weather's moods, by which you cherish all that you have made. All praise be yours, my Lord, through brother fire, through whom you brighten up the night. How beautiful is he, how merry, full of power and strength. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister Earth, our mother, who feeds us in her sovereignty and produces various fruits with colored flowers and herbs. This is the prayer that inspired both the title and the theme of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. This encyclical, issued in 2015, provides a framework for Catholics who seek to pursue a path of sustainability and a deeper understanding of the relationship that we human beings have with the rest of creation. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes that the response of his namesake, St. Francis, to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation or economic calculus. For to him, each and every creature was a sister, united to him by bonds of affection. That, Pope Francis says, is why St. Francis felt called to care for all that exists. If we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up in us spontaneously. Laudato Si was issued in June of 2015, 5 months before the UN climate conference that was held in December of that year, which was called COP21. So, what's a COP? COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and it refers to the countries that have signed an international treaty. In this case, it's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That treaty was signed in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and it entered into force in 1994. There are now 197 countries that are parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they will be meeting from October 31st to November 12th of this year in Glasgow, Scotland. This year's meeting will be the 26th conference since the Convention on Climate Change entered into force. The meeting 6 years ago in Paris was the 21st, or COP21. So why did Pope Francis write Laudato Si before that climate conference? He knew, the world knew, that the average global temperature was increasing and that the conference in 2015 was going to be crucial for reaching an agreement about reducing emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane that trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere and cause global warming. Those greenhouse gases, which are mainly produced by the use of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, have been accumulating in the atmosphere at an unnaturally high rate because of human activities that began with the Industrial Revolution. At the meeting in Paris, negotiators agreed that it was crucial to keep the world from warming by more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the end of this century, and to try to hold the warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's already warmed a little more than 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and we're already seeing impacts such as extreme weather, both heat waves and severe storms and flooding, all of which are predicted by climate models that scientists have been working on for some decades. There are several ways to ensure that countries limit their greenhouse gas emissions. One would be to have an international agreement about how much each country could emit. But industrialized countries resisted that kind of top-down control. So in the Paris Agreement that came out of the 2015 climate conference, each country pledged to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount that it will determine. These are called nationally determined contributions, and they're to be renewed with more ambitious targets every 5 years. These more ambitious commitments were actually due last year, but the conference was postponed until this year because of the pandemic. Pope Francis issued Laudato Si ahead of the Paris Agreement to bring a voice of faith, a moral voice, to the international negotiations. If you read Laudato Si, and I highly recommend it if you haven't, you'll find that it's poetic, it's theological, it's spiritual, and there's also one chapter that's very scientific and very practical, aimed at the negotiators. That was his contribution to raising awareness among the world's Catholics and other people of faith, and to bringing a moral voice to bear on the discussions in Paris. And in doing that, Pope Francis was aided by scientists. It was a joint effort by Pope Francis and theologians and scientists. So now it's 6 years later, and world leaders and negotiators will be gathering again this year, this time in Glasgow, Scotland, for the 26th Conference of Parties, or COP26. And on October 4th, the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, Pope Francis and nearly 40 other faith leaders of world religions met at the Vatican in what was the last of a series of meetings that they had held with scientists throughout the year. And they issued a joint appeal ahead of this year's climate conference, calling on world leaders to take urgent action. In this appeal, they said, "We're at a moment of opportunity and truth. We pray that our human family may unite to save our common home before it's too late. Future generations will never forgive us if we squander this precious opportunity. We have inherited a garden. We must not leave a desert to our children." So why does this Conference of Parties matter so much? This graph shows the most recent scientific evidence from a report issued in August by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It shows that unless substantial cuts are made in greenhouse gas emissions, the world is on track to reach a level of warming higher than human beings have ever experienced. And we don't know what all the consequences will be. They also said that if we're to hold warming to no more than they also said that if we are to hold warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, significant cuts in greenhouse gas emissions must be made. We're already at 2021. We've already completed 2 decades. And because it takes time for emission reductions to have an impact on global temperatures by the end of the century, significant cuts must be made by 2030 and then 2050. This decade, from 2020 to 2030, is crucial for reducing emissions and therefore warming to make the 1.5 degree target possible by the end of the century. Catholics will be in Glasgow to speak out on these issues and to amplify Pope Francis's message. So what are some of the things I'll be talking about? They will urge the negotiators to signal that this must be the end of the era of fossil fuels, of the use of coal, oil, and gas. They will also call on governments to commit to steeper emission reductions, to shift from fossil fuels to renewable energies, and to make that a just transition, an equitable transition, because they're aware that there are communities that depend on jobs in fossil fuel industries, and it's necessary to ensure that there are other jobs available for people in those communities, especially in the renewable energy industry, as fossil fuel use is phased out rapidly. There's also a need to provide financial assistance to help the poorest and most vulnerable countries reduce their own emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And there's a more controversial proposal on the table to compensate these countries for damages they may already have experienced as a result of climate change. There will also be a strong call to protect Earth's biological diversity and its forests, because intact ecosystems are closely tied to a stable climate. Much of the forested land in the Amazon basin, in Africa's Congo basin, and in tropical Asian countries is inhabited by indigenous and traditional communities who have proven to be among the best protectors of these ecosystems. So Catholics will also advocate for these communities' territorial rights. The Earth's atmosphere knows no geographic boundaries, so climate change affects all of us, and it does so in a variety of ways. The World Health Organization has said that climate change is one of the most serious health issues in the world today. It changes the ranges of insects that spread diseases like yellow fever or dengue, and heat makes many health problems worse. Climate change affects water supplies, and also the quality of the water we drink or use for irrigation. Droughts and changes in temperatures can affect where and how food is produced. Heat waves affect health and can make wildfires worse. More severe storms cause flooding, and flooding raises issues related to housing. We saw that in New York and New Jersey after the storms that followed Hurricane Ida. Many of the people who were trapped in basement apartments were lower income residents or immigrants. Climate change can also force people to migrate. Many of the people who are leaving Central America and traveling north in an effort to enter the United States are from countries like El Salvador and Honduras, where a combination of long-term drought and hurricanes has ruined crops years after year. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes that the urgent challenge to protect our common home includes a concern to bring the entire human family together to seek sustainable and integral development. For we know that things can change. We know that humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. Pope Francis is also very strong in connecting what he calls the cry of the earth with the cry of the poor, connecting environmental issues, climate issues, with poverty and injustice. One of these issues is that countries that historically have produced the least greenhouse gas emissions feel the consequences of global warming the most. Let's see what this looks like. This is a website called the Global Carbon Atlas. So what we're seeing here is a map of carbon emissions of countries around the world. We're going to go back to 1960. Take a look at where the carbon emitting countries are. The United States is the largest. There are countries in Europe. Russia is there. China is there. Canada a little bit. Most countries have very low emissions, though, especially the countries in the global south. Now watch what happens as we move through the decades that followed 1960. We see carbon emissions in the US increasing, also in the European Union, in Russia, in China, and Japan. Moving to the 80s, we see Canada increase some. We see China increasing, Russia increasing, the US continues to increase, other countries in the Middle East. Watch what happens in China and India. Parts of the European Union actually begin to decrease some. Japan, China, India, the US. Until we get to 2019. And look at the countries that have the least emissions still. Many in Africa, which are already suffering from drought, from severe weather, from crop failures, from migration, and from conflicts that are at least related in many cases to climate change. In South America also, there are glaciers that are melting. There are also areas that are suffering drought that is exacerbated by deforestation as ranching and farming expands into the Amazon. The countries in the global south continue to suffer the most, and many of the island nations, which are feeling the effects of sea level rise. As rising seas cause people to be displaced from islands, there's a lot of question about where those people will go. So the less wealthy countries and less wealthy people within wealthy countries, especially indigenous people and people of color, tend to suffer the most. They're hit the hardest by climate change. And as temperatures rise, each successive generation of children will suffer more from heat and extreme weather. Remember that graph we saw of rising temperatures? Every decade will be hotter, and children born in each successive decade will suffer more and more from higher and higher temperatures. So these inequities make climate change both a pro-life issue and a justice issue. And this is true not only at the global level and the national level, but also in California. I talked with Ed Maurer, who's a professor of civil engineering at Santa Clara University. And here's what he had to say about how climate change is affecting California and why it's a matter of social justice. So one of the things that we've heard a lot about in California and the Western US in this year and last year as well have been wildfires and heat waves. How do you see these, how are these related to climate change, and how do you see them as justice issues?
Heat waves are a direct result of warming average temperatures, where the extremes end up being more frequently experienced, and we'll experience extremes that we never have in the past. Wildfires are also connected to climate change because heat tends to dry out materials, create more fuel for wildfires. And in California in particular, as we lose the snowpack, there's more ground cover exposed for a longer season each year, meaning we can, there's more opportunities for ignition. So we end up with longer wildfire seasons and more intense wildfires as a result. And it's a justice issue in the same way that a lot of other issues are justice issues, because climate change tends to act as a threat amplifier, meaning that current effects that people experience tend to be made worse by climate change, and justice issues are no exception to that. So people who have to work outside, farm workers, laborers, people replacing rooftops, things like that, are working outside in heat. And of course, when you get extreme heat, they're way more susceptible to heat stroke or other things like that. Farm workers being exposed to contamination from smoke is added to the pollutant load they're already experiencing by working outside in some of these very areas with very poor air quality.
And what about drought? Because one of the things that is also talked about a lot in the West now is aquifers being drawn down, or lakes being drawn down. How is drought playing out is drought directly connected to climate change, and how is that playing out in California?
Yeah, drought is again connected to climate change, somewhat because of a drop in precipitation, but more because of the added heat. So the soils tend to be drier when the rain falls. We have a shorter, again, coming back to the snowpack, the importance of snowpack in California is that it's essentially the largest reservoir we've got. We count on it accumulating during the winter, melting during the early summer to refill our reservoirs. With the warmer temperatures, we lose that. The snow melts earlier, and a lot more of the winter precipitation falls as rain instead of snow, which means we don't have the snowpack to refill the reservoirs. What that does is it cuts back on surface water deliveries to irrigators and cities, other water users, who then turn to groundwater as their other option. So they'll drill deeper wells or rely on increased pumping from aquifers. That tends to draw down the level of groundwater in that area. Large-scale irrigators can drill very deep wells, hundreds of feet deep. Costs a lot of money to do that. Individual homeowners might rely on one single well that may only be 30, 40, 50 feet deep. And then those tend to go dry because they can't reach the level of the groundwater. There are communities in California over near East Porterville and other areas where their wells went dry back in the last drought. They never recovered during the year and a half of somewhat wetter period we've got, and they're still living off bottled water to this day. So drought can be experienced in a lot of different ways. And again, the poor, the vulnerable, those with the least resources to adapt are always the ones to be hit hardest.
These water shortages and water stress, does that affect the food supply as well?
It affects the food supply in as much as there are definitely some agricultural enterprises in the Central Valley that are going to have to cut back. If they're reliant on surface water deliveries, they don't have another option for water, and their water deliveries are cut off because of the shortfall. They'll have to let areas go fallow. In some places, they have to tear up orchards, which is a huge loss. A lot of those crops are export crops, so it's not going to affect the immediate food supply, although it does definitely affect the economy of California. There are other ways other areas of the state are affected with food production. When I think of the Salinas River Valley, which is known as I forget the term for it, but basically they grow the majority of the lettuce, the greens that are consumed in the United States, they've had, again, historically problems with pumping too much water, and they're close to Monterey Bay, they can draw in salt water. And as the seas rise and as the demands for available surface water goes down, their pumping can go up, drawing the salt water in further, and that again kills crops, makes areas less productive. So the effects on food production can be, again, maybe a second level effect, but maybe not so directly.
And you're a father, you have two daughters. What do you see ahead for them? Do you worry about the future for them?
I don't like using the term worry, but I do feel a responsibility to do something to protect, to give them more of the future that looks something like what I had. I don't want to degrade what's available to them. And climate change being driven mostly by carbon dioxide emissions, and carbon dioxide tends to reside in the atmosphere for about a century. Once you burn coal, emit the gases to the atmosphere, they don't come out for a long time, which means it's a multi-generational impact. So the responsibility I feel is to not just do what I can personally to address this intergenerational injustice of my behavior impacting not just my children, but maybe their children and their children. I feel like that's important on a personal level, but I feel like the more important thing, most of the impact I can have is by ensuring that we elect policymakers that can take this issue very seriously and feel the sense of urgency about it that it demands.
Pope Francis has said that people of faith cannot remain indifferent to climate change. On September 1st of this year, the World Day of Prayer for Creation, he issued a statement jointly with Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew and the Archbishop of Canterbury. They said, "We frequently hear from young people who understand that their futures are under threat. For their sake, we must choose to eat, travel, spend, invest, and live differently, thinking not only of immediate interest and gains, but also of future benefits. We repent of our generation's sins." This is a clear call to every Catholic, every person of faith, to reflect and to take action for the common good. So once the climate conference in Glasgow is over, how can Catholics carry forward Pope Francis's call to care for creation? On the 14th of November, the Vatican will launch the Laudato Si action platform, which was announced earlier this year. This platform is designed to guide all the Catholics in the world along a 7-year journey to sustainability. There will be suggestions for actions that everyone can take, grouped into 7 sectors: individuals and families, parishes and dioceses, religious congregations, schools and universities, healthcare facilities, businesses and farms, and other organizations and groups in the church. The 7 areas of action, or Laudato Si goals, encourage Catholics to respond to the cry of the earth, respond to the cry of the poor, implement ecological economics, adopt sustainable lifestyles, implement ecological education, assume an ecological spirituality, and participate in community actions. So what are some of the things that Catholics can do and are doing? I talked with members of the San Diego Dioceses Creation Care Team, which has developed a study guide. Others are welcome to use that guide to form their own creation care teams in parishes, schools, or their communities. The study guide leads to actions, first at the individual level, then at the parish level, and then in the community. Here are some of the actions that they suggest that individuals and families can take. Using household energy more efficiently, things like turning off the lights or switching to LED lights. Eating more wisely, reducing meat consumption with a meatless Monday, or reducing food waste by fasting from food waste. Traveling wisely, using public transit or electric vehicles, biking, walking, reducing air travel. Conserving water. Reducing waste. It's hard to get down to zero plastic, but how close can we get? Reducing, reusing, recycling, and considering switching to renewable energy sources. Parishes and dioceses can take action on a variety of levels. They can engage in prayer to deepen a sense of oneness with creation. They can do education of congregations and students. They can increase their own energy efficiency. Many dioceses around the country are conducting energy audits to figure out where they can conserve energy and reduce their emissions. And many are adding solar panels. Many are also eliminating single-use plastics from parish events. You could arrange carpooling to parish events, organize workshops on Laudato Si and for creation care teams. Join or support a local community group that's working on climate change or sustainability issues. Then you can move out from the parish into the local community. You could recruit a whole new group, replicate the training, and form a new creation care team. You could write a letter to the editor or an article for a local paper or your parish bulletin. You can learn about legislation that's proposed at the state or local level and phone or write your representative. You can visit a local school or another parish and encourage them to take action too. You can join an interfaith group in a march for climate action. These are all things that could be done little by little in parishes to raise awareness about issues related to climate change and sustainability in the spirit of Laudato Si. I asked 3 members of the San Diego team, Father Emmett Farrell, David Laram, and Sarah Mesa, a college student who's studying sustainability and who works with other young people, what suggestions they'd have for other parishes or dioceses. So what would you all recommend, each of you from your own experience, what would you recommend to other dioceses or other parishes that would like to start a creation care group? What could they learn from your experience so they don't have to reinvent wheels?
Well, as I mentioned, if there's someone who's really interested, and that means the pastor is open to us working in the parish, and there's somebody who's interested or passionate, there'll probably be work. We have to resource them, and we've tried to develop resources. It's kind of like taking them by the hand to get them to the action step. The 2 resources that we use, the study guide has, after 2 chapters, an individual action level, 2 more chapters is the parish level, and the 3rd level is advocacy out in the world, policy level. The same 3 levels are in the action plan that was borrowed from another from Atlanta, Georgia diocese, and we were the second to come out with an action plan. Now Washington, D.C. has come out with one, but we put those at the end, was not in the other plan. They had to register, and then they had to do something at these 3 levels. If they do, like the state of California will give them a certificate. You did something in your individual life. You did something at your parish level. You did something at the advocacy level. We want to recognize each one of them. And then, like the Vatican is doing, if they get through all 3 levels, we'll say you're a model parish. Now you can go down and work with the parish next to you or some other church because you've been through the actions. I'll leave it at that.
Just, following up, it depends on who's asking this question. If you're in the San Diego diocese, then by all means reach out to us, and and we'll help you. if you're not, then you need to find the resources within your own diocese, or you could read our Creation Care Action Plan, which is available as a online as a PDF. And then I think a very important thing is to not underestimate your ability to make a difference. I get so many people calling and and saying, I'd really like to do this, but I'm really nobody. I don't know anything. I'm scared to start. And I have those feelings too, and and don't be afraid to ask for help, because you ask and you shall receive.
Sarah, what about reaching young people? What kinds of things have you found effective, or what kinds of things are you trying?
So I'm actually trying to tackle this through two methods, which is going in person to different events. The Diocese of San Diego and parishes within it have very thriving young adult community and presence. So attending their events, and actually, and young adults that I've seen, they're craving face-to-face interaction and community. So it's been or post-COVID, a tremendous amount of people that have come out to different events, and so trying to have that face-to-face interaction, introduce myself, and see where they're from and what they would like to see, what they like to see in their own parishes and community, or in their own life. And the second tactic that I've been trying to use is to establish a social media presence. We live in an age of lots of blessings and tremendous tools just at our fingertips. And so many people, especially given the past year, many people were just online, remote, trying to harness that and establish a presence there and encourage outreach and education of the church's stances and past saints like Saint Francis, who have been such an incredible example, spiritual example and force within the care for creation. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm surprised to see it grow, especially online. We have an Instagram and Facebook account. And Instagram is mostly where young people are, and what I've seen has been the most effective to communicate to large swaths of people and receive that response.
Great, thanks. Here are some resources that your parish or faith group might use. The San Diego Creation Care Team Study Guide and the Diocesan Laudato Si Action Plan are online, as are the action plans of the Atlanta and Washington archdioceses, both of which were developed under Cardinal Gregory. And as of November 14th, the Laudato Si Action Platform website will offer resources. I'd like to close with this photo. These little girls live in an Urarina indigenous community called Santa Lucia in a remote area of the Amazon in Peru, the country where I live. It was a really hot day and they were playing in the river. For me, this picture sums up why Pope Francis's message is important. The climate is one of the things that joins us around the world. And we have the responsibility to leave these little girls a world in which they can thrive. This has been a brief overview of how faith groups can bring Laudato Si into their ministries and find creative ways to live out its principles. The Laudato Si Action Platform, which will be launched later this month, will provide more specific suggestions and guidelines. Thank you for joining me. I wish you joy and many blessings as you live out Laudato Si with your parish, diocese, or faith group.